I'm well known for having unpopular, controversial opinions and discussing things that most other YouTubers are too scared to talk about. Today's video is no different, and I want to talk about the adopt don't shop mentality, why I don't love it, and why I think it's super important to always support good breeders. Animals have to come from somewhere. We can take animals from the wild, but we obviously can't do this for domesticated species like rabbits and dogs and cats. Keeping wild-caught animals also does come with a lot of issues, not only to the ecosystem, but to the animal that you're keeping. Now, a lot of people argue that you should be eating animals from shelters, and even though I think adopting animals are great, it's important to remember that shelters don't produce their own animals. All animals that go to shelters have to come from somewhere. Since animals do have to come from somewhere, I'd rather they come from a good breeder. A lot of people argue that it's completely unethical to be breeding animals when there's so many animals that are overpopulating in shelters, but these are completely unrelated issues. I fully agree that the amount of animals in shelter is completely ridiculous, and it just breaks my heart that tons of animals have to be euthanized every day without ever having the chance to live out their lives in the comfort of a home. However, I don't think not supporting breeders is going to solve the issue of overpopulated shelters. Obviously, we do need change, especially for species like rabbits, where they're often impulse bought and abandoned only a few months later. I think a lot of the change that has to come, which is going to reduce the overpopulation in shelters, is one, education on proper rabbit care and being realistic about what your expectations of a rabbit should be. Also, spaying and neutering is a huge preventative because misgendering rabbits is so common, especially when you're getting them from backyard breeders. So if you get two rabbits and one of them turns out to be a boy and a girl, you're likely to have a litter, and if you're not careful, you could even have multiple. So I'm not saying that the overpopulation in shelters isn't an issue, because it completely is, and I think that we do have to address it. However, it's important to realize that good breeders don't contribute to this overpopulation in shelters. For the most part, animals in shelters don't come from good breeders. For one, a lot of breeders actually have rehoming contracts where if you decide that you can't keep the animal for whatever reason, you have to return it back to the breeder. Also, most animals from breeders just tend to be more expensive, so people don't want to put their $3,000 purebred AKC registered dog in the local shelter. Breeders also usually have wait lists, and they might even have different forms and applications for you to fill out to make sure that you're completely prepared for the animals. Breeders often also have really good support, so if you do get a rabbit and you're having a lot of issues with them, the breeders are really good about making sure you have all the help that you need. Also, again, I think the people that go to good breeders, for the most part, are very prepared for the animal they're going to get. I think this does just come down to the cost. You're not going to spend $5,000 on a purebred puppy if you're not sure that you want a puppy. If you want to impulse buy a puppy for Mother's Day randomly, you're not going to spend $5,000. You're going to go to some local ad you saw that has a $100 puppy. Another argument is that even if breeders aren't directly contributing to the overpopulation in shelters, that there's still no need to be breeding and profiting off of animals. While objectively this seems great, I love the idea of not having animals be worth a certain amount of money. It's completely unrealistic. Natural things aren't always better. There's a reason that animals live so much longer in captivity with human care than they do in the wild. It's not really good for us just to let our rabbits live out and breed naturally, because we're not going to be considering things like genetics. Also, if you just did that, there's probably going to be a lot of inbreeding. So what I'm trying to say is that rabbits have to be bred some way, whether they're bred accidentally, whether they're bred by bad backyard breeders, or whether they're bred by good breeders. Another argument I hear is, why can't breeders just stop breeding until the animal populations level out and then they can start again? Or why don't we not have breeders for animals that are already overpopulated in shelters, but we can just have breeders for more exotic animals that aren't already in shelters? Like I said before, the animals in shelters don't come from good genetic lines. It's important that any species we have, we're breeding it to preserve their integrity. I'm not saying that a shelter animal is any worse than a well-bred animal. I have a shelter puppy and he's the best dog in the world, and I wouldn't trade him for any amount of money. Sure, he might only be worth less than $100, but to me he's absolutely priceless. However, in saying that, I know for a fact that his genetics are not going to be as good as a dog from a purebred breeder. I also know that I don't have lineage on his parents, and I don't know all the genetic predispositions that he's prone to. I also don't really know his temperament and different behavior problems he might have. These are all things that technically do make animals from breeders better. Again, not saying that your shelter animal isn't worth as much as the one from a purebred breeder, but objectively saying the ones that are from breeders have a lot more time, effort, and money put into them. So why can't breeders just stop breeding and then restart later? Well, it's not as simple as you can just stop. For example, most of these animals have a very short period where they're in their prime fertility and where you want to be breeding them. You really don't want to be breeding any senior animals or any very young animals. If a breeder had a huge herd of bunnies that they were breeding and producing really good quality rabbits, and then they just stopped for a couple of years and then decided to restart, they'd probably need a new herd of bunnies. So let's say every single breeder stopped breeding for about 10 years, and then all the populations were a lot better, shelters weren't overcrowded, and then breeders decided to start breeding again. Where would they start? They can't just breed different shelter rabbits with unknown genetics. It's better for them to breed rabbits that have long-lasting pedigrees, and to do that, they have to keep breeding. Also, again, the issue of overpopulation in shelters and good breeders are not related issues. Just because good breeders stop breeding doesn't mean that there'd be less population in shelters, because good breeders' animals aren't the ones that are going to shelters. That's not to say that breeding doesn't have its flaws. I'm completely aware of that. I do think the idea of having an animal be your business can be a little bit finicky, especially when you're relying on things that are so unpredictable like breeding. Also, I'm not gonna lie, a lot of breeder ethics are not always the best. For example, a lot of purebred dogs actually have worse genetics than shelter puppies, and there's a lot of breeds that just really shouldn't be bred, like pugs and French bulldogs. Even with rabbits, most breeders who are breeding rabbits are breeding for a specific appearance, and that usually includes a really short face. A lot of these short-nosed rabbits, like my rabbits, can actually have different teeth and sinus problems in the future. My rabbits both have really good teeth, but I do notice that my lot bunny, who has a really flat face, if you guys can tell, he sometimes does have issues with breathing, and I can hear him kind of wheezing. Also, even with the dogs that are pretty unproblematic, like German Shepherds and Samoyeds and different larger breeds like that, a lot of the times, again, they are still pretty unhealthy when you compare them to a mutt, because the gene pool of a purebred dog is so much smaller. And a lot of these dogs, just over the years, haven't been bred necessarily for the best things, so they have a lot of issues with their hips and their knees. And then there's specific colorings of animals that just shouldn't be bred, like if you're breeding Merle to Merle and you end up with a lot of deaf puppies. And there's so many other ethical factors like that. Every breeder is not a good breeder, and it's hard to know because it's not always so black and white. For example, I think that there's objectively a lot of great bulldog and French bulldog and pug breeders, and they're really doing their part to make sure the breed can be as healthy as possible. But then at the same time, I wonder if that breed should even be bred in general, considering all the issues that they have. A lot of animals from breeders also tend to have more issues with their temperament. For example, like Australian Shepherds that are purebred and Border Collies, they tend to be a lot more high energy just because that's what the breeders are breeding for. But in a family setting, this doesn't always work great. So a lot of people, if they get an Australian Shepherd just from a rescue and they get an Australian Shepherd from a really good breeder, they sometimes have more issues with the one that they got from a breeder simply because they are just so high energy and high anxiety. I really wish the debate wasn't so much so whether we need breeders and more of what a good or great breeder looks like. I feel like because breeders are so stigmatized in the pet community, no one wants to talk about it. If someone does buy from a breeder, they usually try to keep it on the down low, which I think is really sad, because if all of us were discussing our different experiences with breeders and we were collaborating, I think it would be really easy for us to make good resources and find out who the good breeders are, and maybe even give some different tips to different breeders based off what others have done and have worked. Along with it just being so stigmatized in the pet community, I think breeders are some of the most knowledgeable people on the species. For example, rabbit breeders might work with 50 to 100 rabbits every single year, and to completely shun a group of people like that away from the pet community is very ridiculous and quite stupid, honestly, when there's so much insight that they could give. I'm not saying that a breeder is automatically more knowledgeable than someone else. Again, there are some really terrible breeders, and there just might be some normal pet keepers or people that work at rescues that are more experienced than even large-scale breeders. However, I think a group as a whole, breeders are all very knowledgeable, and it's pretty stupid of us to not take any of their advice. Obviously, sometimes tips that breeders use don't necessarily work for us as a pet keeper. For example, breeders usually keep smaller enclosures because they have so many animals to house, and maybe as a pet keeper, we'd rather provide our animals with a bigger space, but that doesn't discount from the fact that they do have experience with so many different animals and they still have a lot of knowledge to be learned. I also don't think the issue has to be so black and white. For example, I would never buy a dog from a breeder, not because I don't like dog breeders, but again, for the issues I mentioned, I feel like a lot of purebred animals do tend to have quite a few health issues, and for me personally, I could never justify spending thousands on an animal when there's another $100 animal that's rotting away at a shelter. So I'll always have rescue dogs. I'll also probably always have rescue rabbits. In my experience, when you get them as babies, their personality is pretty unpredictable. And when my 2 rabbits do pass away, which hopefully won't be for a very long time because I love them and I don't want them to leave. But if I ever am in the position to get another rabbit, I would definitely want an adult just so I could see what personalities I want and what would work best for me. But when it comes to sugar gliders, for example, I would never buy a sugar glider rehomed or adopted. I've done it in the past, and while I still love my gliders that are rehomed, I feel like in the US, gliders have such a small genetic gene pool, and there's really not very many of them. So if you're not tracking lineage, there's a pretty high chance that your sugar gliders are inbred, and a lot of these guys just tend to have a lot of issues. There are so many stories of gliders unexpectedly passing away after just a couple of years, and I truly believe that's because of some problems inside. Also, because nobody's talking about breeders and we've pretty much shunned them from the community, there's so many myths and things going around about them, and people are so uneducated when it comes to breeding. For example, everyone seems to think that when you're breeding animals, you're making a profit or you're doing it for a profit. Actually, most breeders hardly break even, and for the most part, they're usually acquiring a loss. I know so many breeders personally who would actually have more money if they stopped breeding rabbits, and the only reason they do it is because they love the animals so much. Most breeders' primary job is not to be a breeder, and they usually have at least 1 or 2 other jobs to simply support their addiction. Also, most people don't get into breeding just because they want to make money. There are so much more lucrative ways to make money than it is to just breed animals. Most people who start breeding are people that are just extremely passionate about a species, or maybe they have a breed of animal that they love so much and they really want to share it, and that's why they get started. Breeding is a huge initial investment, a huge time investment, and a huge lifestyle change, and for the most part, they're really just like us, if not even more passionate than us. I hope this video was interesting and it shed a different perspective on the adopt don't shop movement. Obviously, adopting an animal is always great. I always say I believe every animal that's been rescued knows that they've been rescued, and they're just so much more grateful for everything you give them. However, I still think that there's a need for good breeders, and we shouldn't shun them from the community, and we should still be supporting them. As people who are actually knowledgeable and care about these animals, it's really our duty to be supporting the good breeders because nobody else will. People that want to impulse buy animals aren't going to go through good breeders because good breeders often have such a long process to get it. One of my friends breeds hedgehogs, and she has a huge application that she makes all her potential adoptees fill out. She loses so much money every single time just because she makes families go through the application process and wait for a hedgehog. If she was just selling hedgehogs to every single person that wanted them, and some people even offer her so much money just to give them a hedgehog because they want one the next day for their child's birthday, but she has to refuse those sales because she knows that it's unethical. I completely understand that this is a very touchy and personal subject for many people, especially if you have personally volunteered at any rescues. I know how emotional it is to see all these animals that are just begging for homes, and when you see someone buy a baby from a breeder, it does feel kind of cruel and a little bit insulting to that little shelter animal that would do anything to have a family. But I hope this does shed an interesting perspective. Again, I think your personal beliefs can be completely different, but I really feel as a community as a whole, we should really be embracing breeders and supporting them more. Also, a lot of breeders actually do a lot of rescue work, and they often take in rescues and different rehome situations and even get these animals the medical care that they need, especially for exotic animal breeders, where a lot of shelters are very uneducated about exotics. A lot of breeders actually partner with these shelters to help the shelters get the proper education that they need. So that was just my little spiel. Let me know what you guys think. I love hearing from you in the comments, so be sure to comment. You can also message me on Instagram if you want to talk personally. I love hearing from you guys. See you in the next video. Bye!